Thank you for joining us for this installment of the Root Cause Coalition's How to Webinar series. My name is Rachel Carlson. I'm the membership coordinator here at the Root Cause Coalition. I apologize for our slight delay in getting started. We had a little technical difficulty, but everything is fine now. Before we get started, I just want to go over a few logistical items for the webinar. Attendees will be in listen-only mode for the duration of the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to view at rootcausecoalition.org/webinars later this week. Our panelists will be taking audience questions at the end of the presentation. If you have a question during the presentation, please type your question into the question pane located at the right side of your screen. We are so excited to have our esteemed panelists join us to share her expertise on implementing universal trauma precautions into an organization. At this time, I would like to pass it off to Shenandoah from the Center for Trauma Resilient Communities.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming, spending your afternoon or late morning with us, depending on where you are. So excited to be here with you guys this morning, talking about how to implement universal precautions into your organization. And so my thought is to get started on some basics, and then we can go from there. As Rachel said, if you have any questions, please feel free to just type them in below, and then we'll get to them as we go. So for those of you who may have saw when I was at the National Convention in San Diego, I'm a faculty member for the Center of Trauma Resilient Communities, and really just in brief, I'll talk about the center towards the end of the webinar. Sort of one of my pet peeves when you come onto a webinar and the first 10 minutes is just about some organization you don't know anything about. But essentially what we do at the center are help organizations, communities, systems embed and embody the science of trauma resilience. So understanding the science of trauma, and then what do you do once you actually understand the information? And so to get us started today, I just wanted to talk a little bit first about outcomes and sort of how I came to this work and why I think it's important regardless of the organization or systems that you work in. So the more that I do this work, the more that this particular slide gets larger and larger, and I find myself wanting to put more and more information, because almost any societal, social, or health outcome that we see, we can now track back to early childhood trauma or trauma within the family system. And so this used to be the big things that we would talk about, like homelessness and incarceration, foster youth, and those sorts of things. But more and more, we're seeing a huge impact on educational outcomes based on early childhood trauma, obviously because of the ACE study, which we'll tap into here in just a second, health outcomes, and not just unemployment outcomes, but actually overall community outcomes of unemployment, underemployment, and reasons that employees call out or absenteeism. So all of these really big important things that are happening within communities nationwide, we can really start to see all stem back to early trauma. Now, funny enough that even when I'm watching Netflix now, right, any show I almost binge watch on Netflix, the same question sort of pops into my mind, which was, so what was the trauma here? And so I'm starting to begin to see that there's even more connections between what happens to us as early child or in our family systems, whether or not we build resistance to that or resilience, and our outcomes later in life. So when we're thinking about it from an employee or an employment focus, we really first have to understand the basics of trauma. And so I'm hopeful that most of you are aware of the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. If you're not, I'm going to send you to the CDC website so you can get way more information about it. But essentially, the Adverse Childhood Experience Study started in the mid to late 90s with Dr. Vincent Folletti in San Diego, California, who was working at an obesity clinic trying to understand why some of his clients couldn't lose weight. And what he ultimately stumbled on was this idea of body image, and he began sort of pushing that as maybe the reason why some of his clients couldn't lose weight. Eventually, he ended up asking a single question in his office to a client, a very personal question, which was, how much did she weigh at the time of her first sexual experience? And he was not prepared when she answered 44 pounds, obviously realizing that she had been the victim of childhood sexual abuse. And so what came out of that was not an immediate aha about child sexual abuse, but really about the things that had been happening to his clients in their childhood. And he eventually developed what became known as the ACE questionnaire, a 10-question yes or no about physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect that might have happened to you before the age of 18. And then, of course, the 5 household dysfunctions. Was there any mental illness in your household? Did you have an incarcerated relative, a mother or stepmother who was treated violently, whether you witnessed it or not? Substance abuse, and then, of course, the big one, not just divorce, but divorce, loss, or separation of a biological parent or caregiver. And so, if you answer yes to these questions, you get 1 point. If you answer no, you get 0 points. And through the culmination of lots of work, he started to realize that his patients who were not losing weight said yes to more of these questions than the patients who seemed to be able to follow a diet and exercise plan and lose the weight. That ultimately, of course, leads to him joining forces with ANDA, the CDC getting involved, and then looking at actually the impact of these ACEs. Not surprisingly, those of us who are raised in homes with alcoholism or drug use were likely to have behaviors that resemble that as well, which to me isn't the fundamental part of this study or even the groundbreaking part of this study. The groundbreaking part of this study is the impact that those of us with scores of 6 or more are more likely to have lung cancer, right? There's a higher correlation between lung cancer and our ACE score than secondhand smoke and lung cancer, as an example. So understanding that, and for me, my first understanding of that was realizing the biological nature of what is changing in us, right? So if we just look at that, there's a stronger link between the things that happen to us in childhood and something like addiction, which is affecting almost every community across the country, than there is between obesity and diabetes, that 2/3 of addicts report being abused as children. So that our war on drugs is a war on traumatized people. And it's actually deeper than that, right? Because those people, right, if you are abused and then you're part of the 2/3 that become an addict, and then if you're a female and you have a child, and then we have the foster care system involved, and now we're homeless with a child, you can begin to see how this compounds itself and can become complex trauma, and how the trauma can actually build upon itself. Contrary to that, we can also then see how someone might struggle with childhood trauma, squeak themselves out of that. Maybe they get a degree, they get a job, they work really hard and they're promoted and they've come to work for your organization. But if they haven't actually addressed that childhood trauma, we can begin to see things like more absenteeism from work, or the way in which they treat our clients or the other people that they work with and staff. So this has sort of a 2-pronged approach to why it's so important. And understanding that is also understanding trauma brain. So why? Why would the things that happen to us as a childhood set us up to have impact later in life? And so most of you might be familiar with the fight, flight, freeze, right? That when we see a bear out on the trail and we're out hiking, that initial instinct that we have to either fight, flight, or freeze. Are you the person who wants to fight the bear, the person who is just trying to outrun the bear, or the person who freezes when all else fails? I've actually added a 4th type of person that I think we don't talk about, but I feel like a lot of people fall into, and that's appease. So we have fight, flight, freeze, and appease. The appeasers, if we think about the bear scenario, are the ones who see a bush and see some berries on that bush and say, hey, let me pick these berries and feed them to the bear and try to make friends with the bear, because if I'm friends with the bear won't want to attack me. And so I often find that I work with organizations and communities. A lot of times they see appeasers within. It's those people trying to make things better for others, doing the right thing. We also see appeasers a lot in domestic violence situations, right? Like if they can just get everything in order and do everything like the person wants, and they can appease them, that perhaps nothing bad will happen. And so it's this constant nature of our brain to go to fight, flight, freeze, or appease that releases that cortisol into our body, right? And we know that in the bear situation, the release of that cortisol, that 7 seconds, is really good for us, keeps us alive, makes us make that quick decision. But what we find is that people living in conflict, people living in trauma, people living in dysfunction are releasing that cortisol 24/7, 365 days a year. And that release of cortisol actually begins to corrode our insides, which is what increases our risk for our health outcomes coming up. So what does this trauma look like? How do we recognize it within other people? And so I'm just going to go through these really quickly, because understanding trauma is understanding how we can just see it in all different types of situations. So when we talk about classrooms, you can hear teachers talk about that kid doesn't have boundaries or is hyper vigilant, but we can see these behaviors in adults as well. So poor motor skills, I'll tell you, sit on a plane once or twice and watch someone try to lift something into an overhead bin that won't fit. And you can begin to just see how motor skills can apply to just about anything. But anger and aggression, flat affect, that person who sits through the meeting, who doesn't change their tone or variate anything, learning challenges, poor memory, you ask someone to do it and they can't remember even 20 minutes later about it. Social isolation. Sorry, somehow I clicked back there. Withdrawn, sickness, self-destructive, boundaries, right? All of these things are the ways in which we might see a behavior that can tell us trauma is at play here. And that's super important, because what most of us do is we see a behavior we don't like and we try to immediately correct the behavior instead of understanding what's underneath and behind the behavior. So when we look at just typical brain development, we know, right, that there's an instinct that if we have a healthy baby born into this world, there's 5 things that that baby can do. A baby can cry and show emotion. A baby can sleep. A baby can eat or suckle. A baby can pee or poop. And a baby can breathe, right? So if we just think about those things that a baby can instinctually do, that nobody has to teach it how to do, if it's a healthy baby, it just comes out being able to do that. Those are those survival things, right? And so in a typical development, we would have that, and we'd move to regulation, and then we would build upon that the social, emotional, and then cognition. What happens in developmental trauma, however, is that the survival becomes so impacted and those needs aren't met. So if you just think about yourself in times of extreme stress, how are your emotions? Typically, people report that they're all over the place. How is your sleep pattern? Most people report they either oversleep or never sleep. How's your eating in times of stress? Most people again report overeating or undereating. How is your breathing? When that bear starts to chase you, what happens to your breath? It gets short and shallow. We don't find ourselves breathing into our whole frame. And then, of course, the one most of us are not supposed to talk about, the peeing and the pooping, right? But when we're stressed, we find that we either have diarrhea or constipation. Again, all of those survival things are impacted at that reptilian part of our brain, that it is just trying to survive. And so when someone is functioning from this reptilian part of their brain, we can't expect them to think about a 5-year plan or what they might want to do when they graduate from high school or even 6 months from now. They're still functioning in this reptilian part of the brain. And so how do we pull them to what we would call the neurocortex or executive functioning? So when we see that behavior that we don't really like, that we talked about on the last screen, and we just try to do things to correct that behavior, 3 strikes, you're out, for example, they can only think about that in the context of their survival, not in the executive functioning of long term. And so we see this obviously a lot in the criminal justice system as well, about the use of punishment when we're thinking about it. So with all of that, the negative outcomes of the ACE, that those of us who have scores of 6 or more are likely to die 20 years before our peers, all else being the same. Our rates of cancer, heart disease are much higher. It basically sounds like a death sentence. And when working with organizations, what we really try to move them from is not just their understanding of trauma, which is important and critical, but the answer to the trauma, which is resilience. How come some people with high scores, myself included, don't end up in prison and don't end up addicts? And what we know is that we can actually build resilience in individuals at any age, and that there's a lot of ways in which resilience can be built, but these are 4 that stick out, which is having a positive, stable adult relationship, being part of a faith, community, or cultural tradition, the ability and time to master a skill of any kind, and then empowering relationships. Knowing that someone wants you to do well can be enough to move you into resilience. The thing here is that most of us have probably heard about positive, stable adult relationships. And the question that I often ask audiences is, what is that and who is that? So if we're going to be positive stables for those people that we serve, it means that we have had to do our work as well, right? So first, we have to be positive. Second, stable, which means we have our trauma in order, we're working on ourselves, we're doing the things that we need so that we can maintain those relationships for other people who may be presented in front of us that haven't done their work just yet. And so all of these things are important as we think about that. And so when you think within your organization, maybe you've done some trauma training, maybe you've done some ACEs work, the question that I want to ask is, what are you doing differently? So in lots of the communities and systems that I go into, they've maybe done a year or 2 of training around really understanding the neurobiology of trauma, really digging deep into a lot of that. But they haven't actually changed anything. They have new information, but they haven't done anything with the information. And this is where the universal precautions really comes in, because how do you actually take the information you know and translate it to do something different within your communities and organizations? So what we know is that Webster's defines trauma as a deeply distressing or disturbing experience, but really what I find explains that a little more is saying that it's an experience or situation that overwhelms a person's ability to cope, leaving them powerless, and something that's outside the realm of normal human experience. Unfortunately, we know that sometimes trauma can happen so frequently to an individual that the trauma itself can appear normal to them. And this is a super important distinction to draw, because oftentimes when we begin talking about trauma, you hear people trying to get in a competition. Well, I had this happen to me. I had that happen to me. My trauma was worse than your trauma. This group over here has more trauma than that group over there. And the truth is that it's an individual experience. It's what overwhelms an individual's ability to cope. And that can vary widely from person to person on what exactly that is. So when we're looking at systems and organizations, I've come to understand that there are systems, communities, and organizations who don't understand anything about trauma. They just don't know what they don't know. And then there's a group of people who know some things. They know that trauma is impacting perhaps the people they serve or is impacting their community in some way, but they don't make any change. And then there's this group who's following the trauma-informed model, the big buzzword of the year, where they know, but they're starting to realize that it's harder than they thought, that the information itself, right? They've become informed on trauma. They have all the information they need, but that there's something else missing for them. And this is when usually organizations and systems become ready. They're starting to realize that it is not just a technical piece, that it's actually a mindset shift that takes place. That yes, they might need a checklist, but that it's more than that. It's convincing people within their organization to do things in a completely different way. That it really is about embedding and embodying the work throughout its entirety to make it sustainable organization-wide. And so when we think about this in a workplace setting, is that most of us, if not all of us, have had something that's overwhelmed our ability to cope. And when we have that unresolved adversity, those things that happen to us that haven't come to completion, that we haven't addressed, we bring those with us everywhere we go. And although we may say your personal life is supposed to stay at home and your work life is supposed to stay at work, unfortunately, we're just one person and we can't divide those things. Our brain isn't able to make those shifts. And so we bring that unresolved adversity with us everywhere we go, including into the workplace. And when we bring it into the workplace, it can cause tension. And that tension then causes low morale, low productivity, and high absenteeism. And then what happens? When people are calling out, other people are being asked to cover that work, which does what? Creates more unresolved adversity. And then this circle keeps fulfilling itself. So we have unresolved adversity that leads to workplace tension, or maybe you would call it toxic gossip in your workplace, where somebody says, oh my God, did you see what she is wearing today? Did you hear how she talked to me in that meeting? All of those kinds of things, right? That's that tension that begins to start, that then leads to people feeling like, why am I here? This place is miserable. I hate coming here. Instead of coming at it from a different place. Normally, when we begin talking about sustainable care, most systems, most organizations want to talk about the care to their clients first. And actually, that's a backwards way of thinking about it. First, we have to talk about self-care, and then we can talk about team care and team wellness, and then we can talk about client or child or outwardly community focused, so we can reach sustainable and implemented trauma care. Again, most systems and organizations want to talk about the people they serve first. But this is a case where we have to do first in order to be the model for the clients. And so if I was with you guys in person, I would ask you just with your thumb and index finger to make a little circle with your hand. So as you're doing that, your thumb and your index finger are touching, sort of the OK symbol. And I would say, now take that and put that on your cheek. Now, if we were together, what you would see is that I actually took that and put that on my nose. And typically when I'm with people and we're doing this face to face and they can see me, although I say put it on your cheek, when they see me putting it on my nose, 9 out of 10 people will also put it on their nose because they do what they see, not what they hear. This is hard to get across in a webinar, I know. But why we have to start with ourselves and our self-care and then team wellness care is that if we are not taking care of ourselves, we cannot take care of anybody else. And if people see that we're not taking care of ourselves, then they believe it's okay for them not to take care of themselves. And so we get into this monkey see, monkey do situation. And so most organizations that I'll go into, when I speak to leaders and I say to the leaders, how many of you want the people on your team to take a lunch? Almost all of them will raise their hand. But when I ask them how many of them take a lunch, very few raise their hand. And this is really helping leaders to understand that their team will follow and mimic what they actually do. So when we begin to take care of ourselves, then we can also begin to practice taking care of the team. What is our team culture? What is it like if somebody does take a lunch? Do other people frown on that? Is that our culture? I've worked in organizations sometimes where in hospitals or residential facilities where people feel like they can't even take bathroom breaks, right? The culture is so diminished that they're literally not even taking care of their basic human functions for each other. And so doing this mindset shifting over self-care and team care then really becomes the easy work of the outwardly focused. How do we take care of the clients and the people that we care for? So when we're thinking about this trauma-informed approach, it's really understanding that it's a framework that emphasizes physical, psychological, emotional, I would add in there mental and social safety as well for providers and survivors. I think this is super important when we talk about safety because the word safety is often only attached to physical safety. And I think when you are talking about doing trauma-informed work and implementing universal precautions, you have to broaden the definition of safety to include all of those other realms of safety, psychological, emotional, moral, and social safety as well. And this is super important as we strive through and understanding the universal precautions. So Samsa laid out for us the foundations of what that should look like. And so I'm just going to click those up on your screen and talk about each one just really, really briefly. So when we are in our organizations doing this at a very deep level, we have to keep into account several key principles. And those are collaboration. When we are truly a trauma-informed organization, we begin to level the power differences between not only staff and different various levels of staff, but also with clients as well. And developing this idea that in relationships, in the sharing of power and decision-making is where relationships and trust is built. And in that trust and sharing of power is where people begin to feel like they have voice, right? That's how we begin to have empowering relationships. When we do this in organizations as well, it becomes a flat organization rather than a top-down or a bottom-up organization, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So the idea of collaboration is that we're having a sharing of power and decision-making. Obviously, we want to keep into account cultural, historical, and gender issues at all times, and leveraging the voice and healing value of those cultural connections. When we talk about peer support as well as a vehicle for establishing safety and hope, the idea of peer is referring to someone with lived experience. So as someone with lived experience myself, as a person who is a former foster youth, I find this incredibly important, and I see organizations all the time who forget to have this peer support, which is we want to create a new program, you want to do this great work, but there's nobody who's influencing that work who actually needed that help. So whether you're creating an at-home system for parents who work and you're doing some new preschool system, or it's integrating integrating inmates back in after release from jail or prison. I see lots of these great, amazing programs that are thought of around tables, but when it comes to getting someone who has lived experience, we often forget bringing that voice to the table to have input and inference because we think we are the only experts. And we forget to ask people what they might actually need. So peer support and lived experience is a super important part of not only sharing power, which gets back to the collaboration, but just having a trauma-informed organization overall. Trustworthy and transparency, I think, speaks for itself. Empowerment through voice and choice, understanding that that experience is something that can be built upon, the parallel process as a staff, and then safety in all those ways that we talked about previously. And then comparing paradigms. And so I'm not going to read through all of these traditional paradigms versus trauma-informed paradigms, but I hope that it will start to give you an idea of how we begin to make this mindset shift. And so one that I like to point out oftentimes is this idea of managing or eliminating client behaviors. Most of the people that I work with are trying to manage clients to do something. So in the court system, we're trying to manage clients on parole and probation. In juvenile systems, right, we're trying to get clients to come in for various things. In foster care, we're trying to manage several different people's behaviors. We're trying to manage kid behaviors, bio parent behaviors, foster parent behaviors, court behaviors. There's all kinds of things. And that's a lot of work. I mean, even if you just think about managing or eliminating, please stop doing that in a teacher or in a classroom setting even. And when we come to the trauma-informed paradigm, the slight shift we're making is providing an opportunity to heal from trauma. So I'm not trying to convince anybody to do anything. I'm just providing them an opportunity to begin their healing journey. And the easiest example I can give to you is a client who's on probation who wants off of probation. So in the typical traditional paradigm, we're constantly saying, you have to get a job, you have to pee in this cup 3 times a week, you have to do these things, right? There's this basic checklist of stuff that a client has to do to get off of probation. And that's managing and eliminating behaviors, and it's a ton of work. But the truth is I don't know a single person who's ever become sober because they were managed, their behaviors were managed by the court system, or that they peed in a cup so many times a week. And to switch that is to say to that client, what do you want? They're of course going to tell you, I want off of probation. How do you do that? I have to pee clean. So how do you pee clean? And it's that question that begins to empower the client. They may have 600 ways in which they could pee clean. They could go to meetings, they could report, they could get themselves checked in. And this is the idea where, the give the man a fish or teach a man how to fish parable is that it's beginning to empower the person to take control of their own healing. And our language can change that. Sometimes we say that clients are sick or bad people. I hear it all the time. Those kids are just bad. They're horrible. They don't listen. They're disrespectful. And if we begin to see it differently, if we begin to say, no, those kids are just hurt. Those kids are suffering. Even in the language that we use, we begin to see that there's an opportunity for something. When we make a command that a kid is bad or disrespectful, there's really nothing we can do about it. But when we say that kid is hurt or suffering, there's suddenly an opportunity for something to change. And this is the beginning of understanding the mindset shift needed to embed and embody this work. So as most of you probably know, we could talk about trauma in any of these 12 slides for 3 more hours. These are some great books, and I want to actually add a 4th that I just actually finished reading that I think is really important, called The Choice by Dr. Edith Eger, E-G-E-R, which talk about trauma and the different ways that it impacts our bodies and what we can do to empower other people to begin to heal from that. And so once we sort of understand those basics of trauma, what it looks like, the behaviors attached to it, and resilience, that there is actually something. We can rewire the brain to begin to think differently, and not only on an individual level, but on a community, organizational, and systems level as well. So as I was trying to explain this to people, universal precaution sort of kept coming up for me as a way to help people understand the mindset shift needed to do this work on a deep level. So universal precaution, those of you in the healthcare universe may be a little more versed in universal precautions, but just briefly, there was a time in this country not too long ago in the 80s, which I know is now 40 plus years ago, but doesn't seem like it to me. There was a time when EMTs would be called to a scene and they would ask people whether or not they had a communicable disease. And if those people said no, they don't have a communicable disease, the EMT would treat them. And if those people said yes, they did have a communicable disease, then the EMTs would put on gloves. I know it's crazy to think about now that people didn't just wear gloves all the time, but it's true. And then in the 80s, when the AIDS and HIV epidemic started happening, it became known that the EMTs were no longer asking people if they had a communicable disease because they actually felt uncomfortable asking people the question. And it was, of course, causing a major health concern. And so a bunch of really smart people wanted to figure out how can we get people to ask this question. And of course, they spent millions and millions of dollars to come up with this. Someone finally saying, I've got this great idea. What if we just wear gloves all the time? What if we actually don't ask patients if they have a communicable disease and we just put gloves on? Because it turns out if I wear gloves and you do not have a communicable disease, it won't hurt you. And if you do have a communicable disease, the gloves will protect both me and you. And so that sort of was the beginning of this idea of universal precaution, that we just do it all the time for everybody regardless. And it worked perfectly, right? So now you would almost be mortified if you went into a medical setting and someone touched you and didn't have gloves on. That's universal precaution. I see trauma as the same exact way. We actually don't need to know about someone's trauma. What we just need to understand is that there is a way we communicate and can be that's a universal precaution, that whether they've had trauma or not, this method will work. And this is what I think is important for organizations. So many organizations get caught in, okay, we need to now be assessing this whole group of people over here to figure out what their trauma is so we can address that accordingly. And the truth is in most instances, we actually don't need to know. We can just say, if we are trauma informed and we have a trauma resilient organization, if someone has not experienced trauma, this method will not harm them. And making the assumption that almost every human on the planet has encountered something that's overwhelmed their ability to cope, this in fact will help them heal and bring more healing to them. And so when we're talking about universal precaution, it is just that. It is created for everybody, not just one particular group, not just assessing this group over here so we can see what their trauma is. In most cases, we don't need to know. We can just make the assumption to have universal precaution for everyone. And so I hope that makes sense for all of you, that universal precaution really just is, this is for everyone. And by everyone, we don't mean just the people you serve. We mean it's for our staff. We mean it's for the families that come in here. We mean it's for the people we serve. It's for our community at large. It's for everyone, not just this group of 25 people over here who cause most of our frustrations throughout the day. And in order to do that, you have to really understand the building blocks of self-care. Again, getting back to that self-care, team care, then community client outreach care is What are you doing for yourself every day, right? To build care for yourself. Most people have heard of daily self-care. Most people have listened to a webinar on self-care. And I want you to think about it in two distinct ways. What are you doing that brings yourself joy? I call this the self-soothing care. These are the things that most people list out. They go for a run, they read, they spend time with family, they veg out and watch TV, they have a glass of wine. That is all self-soothing care. All of those things you need in your life, but that is only part of your daily care. The other part of your daily care is what are you doing to address your own trauma and adversity, and how are you growing on a personal development level? And that's the part that most people try to ignore or try to stamp down. And it's why most people say their daily care routines fail, because they're not addressing both ends, self-soothing care and their personal development care. And then, of course, there's trigger care, which is something that I noticed working with organizations is that an event would happen and it would trigger an employee and it would just spiral the rest of the staff or team and it wouldn't recover. And the whole day would be lost. So trigger care is also two parts. When someone says or does something that triggers you to send you down the sledding hill of your trauma brain, what do you do to stay present and to remain the positive, stable adult? So that's one piece of trigger care. And the second piece of trigger care is after the event and after you've handled the immediate part of that person's need, how do you go back and do the work and asking yourselves the question about why did that trigger me and how is that related to my personal development and growth, which is hopefully something you're working on again in your daily care, right? The foundation piece. What was that? Why when that person talked to me that way, did it trigger me and make me so angry? What is that about? So that hard work. And then of course, crisis care, the piece that most everyone doesn't want to discuss, but what's your plan when the worst possible thing happens? What's your plan when a family member gets a terrible diagnosis or dies suddenly or even after a long illness? How do you care for yourself in that time? What's your plan to care for yourself during that time? What's your plan to care for yourself if somebody lost a job or went through a divorce or some other horrible thing that we know happens? These things happen. How do we care for ourselves in that time? And most of us, when we are in crisis, throw out our self-care completely. And in fact, it's the time when we need it so much. It's just that most of us haven't made a plan ahead of time for crisis care. And so these things happen, then they trigger us, and it throws us all out of sync. But ourself in thinking that we're dealing with all of this stuff and we're part of this work team, you can begin to see how it can throw a whole team out of whack as well. And so if I can just leave you with one sort of funny thing about your self-care is that I noticed because I travel so much that I came home and I was talking to my poor dog. And, you know, I talk to my dog really nicely, right? Hey, sweet girl, you're so chubby, you're cute. Do you need a cookie? How about a nap? And really, that's sort of the language I need to have in my own head talking to myself, right? So talk to yourself the way you would talk to your dog when you think about your self-care. What do you need and how can we help you to be that positive, stable adult? Because ultimately, all of us have to come together to solve this so that we can show love, safety, and stability to those around us. And so I'm so happy that you've shared this 45 minutes of your time with me. I'll be super happy to answer any questions. And just quickly on the center, you know, it started because we knew that trauma had a powerful impact on individuals, organizations, communities, and entire systems, that they can be impacted by chronic stress and organizational trauma. in that those types of working environments can have a detrimental effect on the care providers do that leads to compassion fatigue, vicarious and secondary trauma and burnout. And really our goal is just to build trauma responsive organizations to help them embed and embody it at the deepest levels that they can, and to share that knowledge, understanding, language, practice, and values on all levels. So I appreciate so much your time and spending an hour with me today, and I hope I can answer any questions for you.
Thank you so much to Shenandoah for that amazing presentation. So as she mentioned, we are going to go into the question and answer section of the presentation. So if you'll see on your screen in the GoToWebinar software, there is a pane for everyone to type in and submit questions. So I will give everyone a few minutes to submit some, and we'll go ahead and start reading some out. We might not be able to get to every single question today, but everyone's welcome to contact either Shenandoah or myself or any other Root Cause Coalition staff, and we're happy to help. So the first question we have from one of our participants for Shenandoah is just asking again for the name of the author and the study referenced as the source for the ACEs survey.
So for the ACEs survey, I would direct you to the CDC website, which is cdc.gov, G-O-V. When you get to that website, if you just do a search for adverse childhood experiences, you can bring up the original study, the original survey, as well as the new information and the new updates that they've been doing on it as well. For the book that I mentioned, that was actually written by Dr. Edith Eger, and her last name is E-G-E-R, and the name of the book is The Choice.
Thank you so much for that. Another one of our participants asks about implementing this training. How long might it take to train staff in an organization that is a big organization that might have lots of divisions and maybe 2,000 plus employees? Do you have some best practices for implementing this training for a large organization?
Yeah, typically for large organizations, what we do is saying, what's the first thing we're trying to accomplish? And so, right, different organizations are ready at different levels. Some need to really spend a lot of time on the neurobiology, the trauma, the science. Others need to spend more time actually on the culture itself, so self and team care. And so doing the training first around all of that is super important. So knowledge always comes first, so we can have language and some initial tools to get us started. And then it is after that, it's really about that embedding and embodying, the practicing, the doing over and over again, the coming back, the tweaking, the reminding people. And what I'm really trying to encourage organizations is that if you're going to take this on, that there is no arrival point. Unlike some trainings you do where we got all the staff trained, they took a quiz, we passed it, and now we're certified. This is work that is constantly going on. You can never arrive to having it perfectly, because by the time you get lots of great tools into practice, right, we drop a ball over here somewhere, we learn about something new, and we have to retweak over in this department or this place. But always, I think the first place is getting common language throughout any organization or system.
Another one of our participants asks, for institutions who are looking to implement trauma-informed care, who should be involved in the planning and implementation? Should it be some leadership, the frontline staff, clients, sort of who is the first person who's having these conversations?
So typically when we're contacted by an organization, there is usually some planning group that's been put together who can look all kinds of different ways. Sometimes it's a CEO or an executive director who's contacting us who says, I want to bring this for my organization. Sometimes in school systems, there's like an SEL team that's been meeting saying, we're trying to figure out what we should do. What I can tell you is that most times after our organization has been contacted by another organization, we actually look at who that team is that we would call the core team, that's going to sort of be the reminders, and that is the team that ultimately changes, because usually we ask it to be made up of people who are representative from across the board. So in school systems, we ask that means it's parents, it's students, it's administrators, it's principals, it's teachers, it's counselors, right? So typically we would ask that the core team be made up of a wide variety of people from throughout an organization. But usually the initial people are some group in some department buried somewhere who's like, we really need to do this work. So I think it shifts and evolves over time for sure.
Another participant wants to know, are you aware of any softwares that are available that can be used to help implement trauma-informed actions in a community organization?
It's so funny that I got asked this question. I actually just became aware of a software that I have not used yet, that some communities are starting to use, and I have to think about what it's called because it just crossed my thing. So I'm actually looking through a bunch of emails. Give me 1 second. Oh, I know it's here. So I would go to mdlogix.com. So it's mdlogix.com. This is the only software that I'm aware of. I've just started doing sort of my research on it, but I think it could be super helpful.
Thank you so much for that. Somebody also asks if you could share the name of the book and that author of the last book you mentioned on your slide for further resources. That additional book you're talking about.
Yeah, so the name of the book is The Choice, and I'll type this down in the chat. I don't know if everyone can see that as well, The Choice, and it's by Dr. Edith Eger. E-G-E-R.
Thank you. Another participant asks, are there any organizations that you think could serve as good case studies for integrating a trauma-informed approach from the ground up that you've worked with or you've heard of potentially?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say if that person wants to contact me about whatever specific type of organization they're in, I, off the top of my head, can think of a couple of school systems. Right now, the Krosnorth School in North Carolina comes to mind. There is Vista Maria is doing some work, a residential girls' school. There's some health and hospital systems that I know of that are just starting to play and toy with this idea in various departments before they bring it organization-wide. And there's some communities, some very large communities. Right now, Louisville, Kentucky is involved in a 5-year-long implementation of their entire community. They are just starting their second quarter of this work, so they're about 6 months into their 5-year. So the first quarter obviously was a lot of planning, and they're just now starting to do community-wide training and implementation, but following along with what Louisville's doing on a very large system is a great one to start with as well.
Great, thank you. And I just put up Shenandoah's contact information one more time for everybody. So if there's any other questions that you want to email her specifically about, that is up there, and I'll go back to the root cause contact in just a minute. I think one more question we have that one of our participants is asking is, what ways can organizations measure change and outcomes when they're implementing trauma-informed practices to document successes?
Yeah, so we do some assessments up front as well. We've been using the Arctic system of assessing, so you can measure. And again, it's what are you trying to measure? Are you trying to measure wellness? Are you trying to measure knowledge and information? There's a lot of things to measure. Are you trying to measure outcomes? You know, in the school systems, does this have an impact on graduation rates? So I think based on your system and organization, we can kind of help you come up with some measurements, but we use the Arctic assessment for doing those both before, during, and after.
Great. And then our last question before we're finishing up is also a quick one. Can you repeat the name of the software one more time that we talked about?
Yes, it is MDLOGIX.com. That's the website to find out about it. And I'm putting that in the chat as well. And the founder of that, who came through me, sort of like a friend of a friend, and I've had a couple of contacts with. His name is Dr. Alan Tien. He did a bunch of work at Johns Hopkins. Some people may be familiar with his work as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to everybody for your wonderful and thoughtful questions and for participating in this session today. Before we completely end, I wanted to, again, thank Shenandoah for this wonderful, informative, practical presentation, and thank you to everybody who's already submitted some nice feedback in the chat box. As a reminder, this session has been recorded and will be available for viewing at rootcausecoalition.org/webinars. You will also be receiving a follow-up email that will have a link to that website, which will also bring you to the recording and a copy of the slides to download. Our next upcoming webinar will be on February 24th. The exact topic and registration will be released later this week, and you will be able to access that also at rootcausecoalition.org/webinars and also in our weekly email list. If you would like to learn more about the Root Cause Coalition, be on that weekly email list, you can contact me, Rachel Carlson, at rcarlson@rootcausecoalition.org. Additionally, if you are interested in presenting on a future webinar like this one today, you can contact me. Again, my email is rcarlson@rootcausecoalition.org. That is rcarlson@rootcausecoalition.org. Thank you so much again to Shenandoah, to all our participants for their wonderful questions. I hope you have a wonderful day, and we will see you again on February 24th for our next session.